Uh, yeah, it's surrounded by water, and so they're actually in it. It's filmed on the location there. But so yeah, so if you want to watch it, notice the whole movie is on YouTube, so you could go watch it for free. It's based on a book by Friedhof Capra called The Turning Point, um, which is about the change in the way science has gone from kind of the science of Descartes to a kind of modern organic way of looking at science, which is part of where we're moving in the course as well. So you could use this movie, as kind of a summary of the change in our look, the way we look at physics. But she mentioned Descartes in that room, saying I'd have to go back to Descartes because the clock is about the same time as Descartes, where they're inventing clocks, they're inventing mechanical dolls, and the gardens at Versailles had all these mechanical water machines that ran the irrigation and stuff at the gardens in Versailles that are still there. A big tourist attraction, even though, of course, Versailles is no longer the palace of the king or the emperor, because, of course, they don't have one anymore. It's just a big museum, right? But the connection with Descartes and the reason why she, in a sense, blames things on Descartes. One of the things she'll say just a little bit later, I guess I should have let it run, I guess, a little bit more.
Well, you're right in a way, Mr.
Jack. Call me Jack.
Okay, Jack. You are right in a sense. But it wasn't always so. Not before Descartes. When he introduced such thinking, it amounted to a revolutionary break with the church. He said, I don't need the Pope to tell me how the world functions. I can find that out for myself. Because to me, the world is just a machine. And then he became fascinated with clockworks and made a clock into a central metaphor. He said, I consider the human body as nothing but a machine. A healthy man is like a well-made cook. A sick man is like an ill-made cook.
Well, the metaphor seems a little clumsy now, but it works, doesn't it?
Yes, so successfully that scientists came to believe that all living things, plants, animals, us, are nothing but machines. And that's the fallacy. It carried over into everything, arts, politics.
I don't know, it seems to me that most people don't even remember who Descartes was. I'm sorry, I guess I just don't follow you. But I'd like to. You could just break it down into 30-second media bites, that's more what he's used to. Very funny. All right, what is it that I don't recognize? What's so bad about Descartes?
There's nothing bad about Descartes. In fact, I think Descartes is wonderful. He was a godsend to the 17th century. But times have changed since then. We need a new way of understanding life. Once it's been replaced by a tiny quartz crystal.
So even though Descartes gives us a particular model that has been replaced today by, I would say, an organic model, right? It's kind of more romantic too, and more difficult, right? Because a device like a clock, you can take it apart, oil it, put it back together again, and it's very understandable, how the parts all work. But how do you take apart an oak tree, right? Right? You know how much more difficult that is. We're always discovering new aspects of the cell structure and the DNA and all those things that put an organic thing, living thing, together, much more complex than a mechanical clock. And so our science today is much more complex. And everything is interconnected. You can't just break it down into a specific little thing. But what she's pointing out is that Descartes was wonderful because this was all new. The idea of the mechanical model that explained things scientifically was a new development. Along with his mapping technique, the way he figured out how to map everything so that you could more exactly detail the terrain. Of course, today it's just absolutely amazing. We've got GPS satellite devices that enable us to know exactly where we are, how to find this building. That's that kind of stuff is just absolutely amazing. But what got Descartes started on this new method, which he called a scientific method, how to go about using a correct method in order to figure out problems and things. His book is called The Discourse on the Method, the Right Method for, let's see, where do I have? So The Discourse on the Method. And by the way, it's in the Discourse on the Method that he also ends up with this famous quotation, which you can see here. I think, therefore I am, right? See that? So even though we always assign the meditations as the reading assignment to go with Descartes, even when the links don't work, dang. You can easily find it. There's plenty of copies on it. I was just looking for it before class started, and I found an audiobook of it, which I clicked on, and it just started reading the book, which I don't know if that would be fun to do. But the famous line is not actually in the meditations that everybody knows. I think, therefore I am. Not to be or not to be, as Harriman says in the movie. That was a joke, right, that everybody should have got. But the real quote that everyone thinks of when they think of Descartes, so if you're at a cocktail party and someone says, "Oh, did you ever read Descartes?" Your best response is, "Oh yeah, I think, therefore I am." Plus you've got all those jokes, right? Descartes sitting in a bar and someone asked him, "So what do you think of such and such?" And he says, "Oh, I don't think," poof, he's gone. It's supposed to be a joke. Ha ha, there's all kinds of, you have to study Descartes before you die, because you've heard the expression, you have to put Descartes before de Hearse. I think there's just tons of stupid jokes on it. The cart is like the wagon, and the horse, okay, but so what got him started was growing up with the monks arguing among themselves over metaphysical questions. And they had two different sides. Even though Aquinas solved the problem and merged Aristotle with church dogma, so merged Aristotle with Plato, basically, you still had two sides, practically everywhere, of people that would take either the Platonic side or the Aristotelian side. I think I mentioned the nominalists, following like William of Ockham, would take the Aristotelian side, and you had folks like Duns Scotus following the Platonic side. But there was this kind of disagreement practically anywhere, and as a result, no one really felt certain about anything they knew. And Descartes, at a party, said to one of his friends in Paris that he could solve the problem, that he could, put all of knowledge on a firm basis. And the archbishop that he was talking to said, well, do it. So he moved away to the Netherlands, where he could work in relative peace. And chances are the main reason he did that, and that comes from A.C. Grayling's book that argued that he was a spy for the Jesuits, that the king no longer, the one king died and the replacement was not pro-Jesuits, so Descartes basically was in trouble. Rather than staying in Paris, left so he wouldn't be a part of the enemy camp, and went to the Netherlands instead. And by the way, one of the famous paintings from the time, I'll show you the painting, it's a Rembrandt, and it's the what's it called when you study a body? Autopsy. The autopsy of Dr. Tulip. I just want a picture of it, though. So if you're familiar with this painting, I don't know. This is Dr. Tulip, and by the way, he's the one for whom tulips, they weren't invented, they already had them, but they're named tulips because of him, right? So he was wealthy and basically made tulips like a specialty in the Netherlands, which they still are, right? You're probably familiar with all the tulip farms or whatever they're called. But this is an autopsy where or the anatomy lesson, where he's explaining the parts of the body to a group. By the way, Rembrandt didn't paint this on location. He had all of these individuals come to his studio, and he painted them and put their painting into the painting, including Dr. Tulip. We actually know who the dead body was. He was a criminal that had been punished before for doing, stealing and things of that sort. In fact, one of his arms, this one, had already been cut off for one of his punishments. So Rembrandt invented an arm to put it there, rather than leave the one arm off. He had been hung that morning for crimes, and Dr. Tulip had paid the executioner to bring him the body afterwards. And this was a dinner and a show. So all the men at this autopsy were also eating in the audience. They were eating dinner.
Gross.
And one of the individuals, not in the picture, but in the audience of this autopsy, was René Descartes. So that's pretty interesting. There's a whole book about that particular.
Like that autopsy.
Huh?
You can think of what an autopsy nowadays would be like, identifying things and whatnot. I just imagine what an autopsy then was like. Look at all this ooze coming out of his stomach.
This is.
I wonder what this stuff does.
And
Well,
meanwhile, let me take another.
It's like Swedish Chef was doing an autopsy.
It's hilarious, actually. However, that's the way things were. Descartes clearly was doing his own dissections of animals too. And in fact, one of the reasons we easily know that is because he discovers something. The pineal gland. So this is a drawing. René Rene Descartes' illustration. You can see this is an illustration of dualism. Inputs are passed on by the sensory organs to the, what the heck is that, in the brain, and from there to the immaterial spirit, right? So he found the pineal gland and identified it as the source, or the point in the brain where the soul connects to the body. Because he believed that there was a mind and a body. And the mind was not just the organ in the brain, you know, the wet stuff in your head, but it was a spiritual soul that made a connection with the body in a particular place. Now, of course, the question is, did he really think that? I don't know. He writes that he does, but remember, even though he's in the Netherlands, he's got to be careful. Even the Netherlands has its restrictions on the kinds of things you could think. They're open to different religions. Even the Jews were safe there, provided they behaved, right? But the reason for that, by the way, is because the Netherlands was right smack in between Catholic France and Lutheran Northern Germany. And so it's good business to be a moderate and have tolerance for people of different religions. And this is at the point where the Netherlands is actually the empire, where they're the ones with all the money. And by the way, if you go and visit some of their museums, their art museums, they're all just full of people posing in black outfits with white collars and black hats. Even the women, you know, all sitting around. It was like selfie kingdom, right? Everybody's doing selfies, except, of course, the way you did it back then was you had Rembrandt or another painter paint you sitting, you know, all around the table, you know, so that everyone could tell who was the important people in the town, etc.
That and boats.
Pardon?
That and boats. They love painting their boats.
Oh, yes. Well, that was what made them the empire, because they used wind power. They developed much more powerful boats. And, of course, the windmill to do things. So when we look at economics and we look at what built empires, the first one is the Netherlands. And that was based on wind. And then the second one was Britain, and that was based on coal power. And then the United States, based on oil power.
I think Spain was somewhere in between there.
Spain was, they had wind power too, but...
You're just talking about the first.
Well, when we talk about an impressive economic system, especially because Netherlands was such a small little country, and yet they still have claims to some places worldwide, like in the Indonesia and Philippines, I think, and stuff like that. And they were at war with Spain, and Spain lost. William of Orange basically won, became the King of England. So Spain had a heyday, but they went about things the wrong way. Instead of creating colonies and building wealth in the colonies, they basically used their colonies only to take out silver and gold and send it back to the homeland, where they spent it on stuff by buying it from the Dutch. and if you know how economics works, right? The people that end up with the money are the ones that are the wealthy ones, the ones that spend the money in order to get wealth, or right? So they took the money from South America mostly, and then they spent it on stuff. So they had a tremendous period of growth and wealth, but they didn't build something that continued to build wealth for them. And in fact, it actually cost them a lot to run the empire the way they did it. Remember, the British did something different. They sent riffraff, especially religious riffraff, that they couldn't stand having around England because they had all those weird ideas. So they sent them, here, go found a colony in the New World. And they did. And they wanted to, get away from Europe, where they weren't allowed to build their colony based on their crazy ideas, because the elite wouldn't have it, right? So they instead went and they founded Pennsylvania, the Quaker colony. They founded Plymouth, Boston, right? The kind of a Puritan colony, and the Methodists are in like Virginia, and so they're all kind of like different religious colonies. Maryland was Catholic, and obviously, Blessed Mother, and Louisiana, of course, is Catholic because it was the French, right? So, and there's some other Catholic ones like in Michigan and stuff, right? Because the Hudson and Lawrence were all French. You know how the French did, the Lawrence River and then the Mississippi. That was where their colonies were, and the British were the ones doing, from Georgia up. So you end up with religious colonies. The original 13 states were all kind of based on various religions, which eventually, of course, meant that when they formed the United States, they had to come up with a way of dealing with the separation of church and state, because they didn't want any one state church to dominate all of the United States. And so, of course, you get Jefferson's declaration of the separation of church and state in Virginia, and then that became part of the United States Constitution as well. But back to Descartes. Descartes is trying to establish a firm basis for knowledge. And so he begins what he calls is a universal doubt. And so he starts off by doubting everything he can. And if we do look at the Meditations, it's really kind of funny. It's a 5-day version of St. Augustine's reply to skeptics. I'm not sure. This is really not it. But if you get a chance, I'll try to find it. But there's like one paragraph that St. Augustine, way back in the Confessions and the City of God, his reply against the academics, because the academics at the time were skeptics. And he argues that there are 3 things that I know for sure. 1, that I exist. 2, that I know. And 3, that I love, both existing and knowing that I exist, right? So his answer is basically, you can't deny that you exist, because who's it denying it, right? obviously I exist. And then once I know that I exist, I know that I know that I exist, so I'm happy about that, right? And I love knowing it, right? So there's three things that he says he knows for sure, that he can't doubt. That he exists, that he knows that he exists, and he loves such, an experience, right? So Augustine actually covers this, right? When we look at Descartes, he starts off by talking about his senses and so on. So he talks about how, we see and touch all this stuff, but in different light, and, I can be dreaming. I might not. I mean, have you ever had a dream where you thought, you were doing something and you woke up and none of that had really happened, right? So you can obviously have dreams and so on. One of the neatest things today is that I could refer to the movie The Matrix. Have you seen it? Yes, you both seen it. I imagine practically every American alive has seen The Matrix. Maybe even more. There's a couple other, like there's The Matrix and there's The Matrix Regurgitated or something, whatever. I don't remember what the other ones are called, but basically in The Matrix, the hypothesis that sets the movie, the plot, right, is that nobody's really living an actual life. They're actually asleep kind of in a vat of jello somewhere, running some kind of battery to run some great big computer, but their minds are all connected to this computer that makes them feel like they're getting up every morning and going to work and having a daily life. And you know the plot of the movie, right? And of course, Neo, I guess it is, that somehow gets plucked out of his vat of jello and ends up realizing how horrible life really is. But he prefers knowing to not knowing, so he doesn't want the red pill or whatever. He wants the blue pill. I don't know which pill it is. But he ends up wanting to stay out of the vat. And, an awful lot of other folks actually say, hey, put me back in the vat. I had a good life. Don't screw me up with this stuff. So the neat thing about all that is there's this evil deceiver that is this computer that's making everybody think they're living a life when they're really not. Well, Descartes gets to that point too, and basically says, what if there's an evil deceiver that's deceiving me into thinking that anything I'm experiencing is really the case? In fact, what if I don't even exist? Well, if that's the case, and this is where Augustine comes in, and he's clearly studied Augustine when he was a kid, because that was part of any course as a kid that he would have taken with the Jesuits. Clearly, I am the one that's thinking and questioning whether or not I exist. And so I can't doubt that I exist. So I think, therefore, I am, right? Cogito ergo sum, right? Cogito means I think, first person singular, and ergo means thus or hence, right? And in fact, we use ergo in English, don't we? And sum is I am, right? Sum as est, sumus est sunt is I am, you am, he, she, or it am. It's so my Latin's better than my English, I think. In any case, so he's absolutely certain that he could doubt everything else except that he exists. By the way, a very important part is that he's still not sure that his body is communicating directly to him. It could be an imaginary body. All he knows for sure is that his thinking substance exists. His res cogitans. Res is a stuff, and cogitans the thinking. So the thinking exists. He can't doubt that. but he can still have doubts about his senses and so on. Well, and because our sense data does lie to us a lot, right? So how to go to the next step then? And this is where he's really kind of wishy-washy, I think. And that is, he goes to God and says, I have a conception of God, and God is all-powerful, omnipotent, etc., infinite. And the problem of cause and effect is that the cause has to always be greater than the effect. Right? You could use a car to push a wagon, but a wagon can't push a car, right? The cause always has to be greater than the effect. And so the idea of an all-powerful God in my head could not have been caused by me, Descartes, because I'm so finite. So the only way I could have the idea of God in my head is because God put it there. So he's convinced that God exists because of that argument, which everybody thinks it's wishy-washy. It doesn't really prove that. But he's convinced that it does. And as a result of that, and since God is a good God and not an evil deceiver, when I know things clearly and distinctly, I know that they are true. I have this kind of intuition that I know that it's true, right? But what does he mean by clear and distinct? Aha. This is really kind of political, because for him, what he knows is clear and distinct is mathematics. 5 plus 5 equals 10. You know that for sure, there's no doubt. My hand is in front of my face. I can still doubt that. I might be dreaming, but I can't mistake 5 plus 5 equals 10, even if I'm dreaming. That's true even in a dream, right? So math, you can trust absolutely. But by the way, notice that mathematics is his forte, his specialty, not the church's. So he develops a scientific method based on mathematics, and mathematics is the source of all of his certitude. And you can trust it because God wouldn't lie to us about it. But notice that doesn't mean that you could trust the dogma of the church. But he is a dualist. He does argue that there is a mind and a body, and the mind is the important part of us, and the body is this part of us. And he does come up with this interaction site, the pineal gland, where he thinks that the homunculus lives, so to speak. That's really kind of hilarious. The homunculus. So you get this crazy image of a little guy sitting inside your brain in kind of like the driver's seat. It reminds me, there was a movie called Ready Player One, if you saw that, where like some of the characters end up driving robots. They're actually sitting in like the head in a like control seat, and they're driving the robot and using the robot to fight and stuff. That's the kind of image you get. But the problem with that is you end up with a question, well, who's driving this body? So you've got the image of another homunculus in that one, and I don't know, does it give us multiple? But you can end up then with like an infinite problem of who's driving this body, and then someone's driving this body, and someone's driving this body. And of course, when you get right down to it, if the soul is not physical, how does it drive the body? How does it interconnect with the body, right? This has been referred to as Descartes' error. And lots of folks pick on poor Descartes because of this. Descartes' error. This is Antonio Damasio. He's a contemporary brain scientist that argues that the brain, the solid material of our brain, is all of us. There's no extra, non-substance soul that interacts with the brain, but the brain is literally doing everything, all the thinking and so on. So that's, Descartes' error. But now here's my thinking. I don't think Descartes really thought there was a soul separate from the body. I think he would have actually agreed with Damasio on that, and other folks that also criticize Descartes. But I think what he was trying to do was keep himself safe from the church, because if he said we were just a body, then I think they would have been critical of him, and he could have been in danger. By the way, he was in touch with Galileo, and remember Galileo got in trouble with the church because of the Copernican system. The idea that the earth moved was against the Aristotelian science, which was part of the church dogma. And so you end up with Galileo in trouble. He eventually ended up in house arrest. His one book ended up being published, even though he promised the church he wouldn't publish it, but some of his friends published it in the Netherlands, which would have gotten him in trouble, but he wrote a preface to the book that was published in the book, where he explained that he had nothing to do with publishing the book.
So that makes sense.
Just that easy.
Yeah,
I
I didn't do this. This is not my fault.
It says in the book.
It's a bit of foresight, and it's not my fault.
Yeah, but in any case, he of course was under house arrest, and the main thing that the Pope was upset with him was that he said that the earth moved and that the other idea was false. Remember at the beginning of the class, the course, I argued that today our view would be that there's lots of different models that we could use that are all useful in their own context, right? And in a sense, when we go back and look at the conflict between Galileo and the Pope at the time, Barberino, I think his name was really the Pope was the more sophisticated individual, and he understood that, yeah, you can have both models, it could be viewed both ways, but we're better off just leaving things the way they are instead of getting people all stirred up over it. And Galileo was absolutely adamant that there was only one perspective that was true, and of course ended up publishing and saying that, and so you ended up with a lot of stuff going on at the time of the Reformation. So, and remember, they were also at war with the Ottomans, and Vienna was a touch and go point. There's the siege of Vienna from the one period. So that's 1683. I mean, that was, Europe almost became Islamic then, if you think of it, right? And then the other one was the Battle Vienna, two different times. The Battle of Vienna. Well, I'm looking for so there's 1529, but 1485. And who's the one that had the hammer? Charles Martel. So Europe was almost taken over by Islam multiple times. In fact, at one point, the reason for the Pope's idea of the Crusades attacking the Holy Land was not just to try to rescue the Holy Land, but to try to undercut the forces that were coming trying to attack Europe. So it was like let's attack their rear, to try to weaken them from taking Europe. And by the way, notice the reason I have a couple of references to other sources in the notes that I posted, like Douglas Murray, for example, was that a lot of people are very concerned about Europe still being overrun by Islam today, right? With the migration of the people coming from the Middle East. By the way, just today in the paper, they were talking about there's a big fight at the border between Greece and Turkey right now because Turkey has quit trying to hold back the tide and is letting people go through. So, of course, now the problem is Greece is trying to figure out how to stop people from flooding into Europe who are Islamic, from Syria and other places. So that's a continuing issue. And remember, pardon?
Is that also, I saw there, you had mentioned it Tuesday, but you, Ramadan?
Tariq Ramadan.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. He's an Islamic scholar in Oxford. And he's recommending to the Islamists that do get into Europe that cooperate, blend in, and just reproduce, and eventually will just overpopulate and take over. That's his advice. He says that in his books, and he's a professor at Oxford. There's lots of panels where he argues with others and so on. So this is not not news. I mean, that's clearly out there. And stuff, but I mention this because on top of everything else, here comes Galileo screwing everybody's mind up with this idea that the Earth is moving. Can you imagine the panic? Right? And then Martin Luther, changing the religion, and fighting the only way that the Pope can get money and stuff. Or one of the main ways he gets money. And of course, Descartes, being, an individual that wanted to have a nice long life, he didn't. And everyone blames Queen Christina for this, because Queen Christina of Sweden emailed him in the old-fashioned way, with paper and a messenger or someone, and said, I'd like you to come to Sweden and teach me how to draw tangents, like those, sines and tangents and things of that sort. And so, okay. And in fact, when he got there, she did have him write up like the laws of Sweden or something. I forget, whatever. There was some document she wanted him to write up because he was such an educated man. So he did that. But the minute he finished that, he ended up catching pneumonia and died. So he died in Sweden, but his body was shipped back to Paris. And this is kind of famous because somebody stole the head. And so his body was buried in one place, but his head ended up in the museum across the street. So his body's in one place and his head is in another. So A.C. Grayling jokes about how for Descartes, there really is a mind-body problem.
Yeah. He had a premonition.
Don't know. But, there's just tons of stuff about Descartes that's fascinating. He moved every 3 months. If you wanted to get in touch with him, you had to go through his friend in Paris, because his friend in Paris was the only one that knew where he was. What else? I think one of the reasons he kept moving was because he was dissecting animals in his living room, and this was before they understood bacteria and cleanliness and soap. So you can imagine his houses must have gotten really awful. So 3 months was just about as long as he could stand it, and he moved to another place.
Gross. Imagine the new tenants. What?
What's wrong with this place? However, Descartes, pretty famous, clearly France's favorite philosopher. So whenever you want, if you go to the Louvre, it's up. Here's his statue up on the Louvre. The thing is, there's statues every other window, so you have to know which one, I guess. I guess you can actually see it in this picture. It's a really good picture. You can see it says Descartes. A. Descartes.
Is the Louvre more than just that?
The Louvre was a palace.
Because all you ever see at the Louvre is the glass pyramid. And then
Oh.
there's stuff below that. But then, like, is it
Oh.
within, like, a whole square?
There's the island of Paris, which is like an island in the middle of the Seine, and the Louvre takes up a good portion of that whole area. But it was a huge palace, including a chapel, and it's now, of course, a museum, but it's a huge museum. So yeah, you can. I've never been there physically. I've only gone there with my Oculus Rift and visited through my goggles. But hey, I feel like I've been there lots of times. And people are really very generous with their photography because they take pictures like all down the halls and all around. And so once I'm into the thing, and you just click along and you're like moving like you're walking along the halls looking at all the paintings and so on.
That's pretty cool.
So one of the other people that Descartes wrote to besides Galileo was Thomas Hobbes. So let me switch back to Thomas. Who we really don't cover as much. And in a way, that's kind of a shame. Because, and we've got his tomb here. He was born in Malmesbury. This is Latin. So it says Malmesburiensis instead of Malmesbury. But I think Malmesbury is considered the smallest town in England. Or wherever he's buried, that's the smallest town in England, is that Oh, it's Alt Hucknall. So you could go, online you could go look at that. There's a Hobbes Club or a Hobbes Society that has a dinner, a special meeting every year in Malmesbury, and you could actually go visit Malmesbury, the cloister where he went to school as a kid. It's still there, although of course it's not a school anymore. Now it's a garden, actually. In fact, I'm not sure it's really a garden we should go to
Is that
visit.
the Abbey from the movie Da Vinci Code? Are you familiar with the movie? Never mind.
One of the abbeys that where they found the
Yeah, in the end.
In the
when
end.
when they discover that.
could be, not sure. But
Never
if you
Not important.
if you really go there and not just in the movie, Malmesbury, garden, or how do you spell it? Oh, he's dead. So the naked gardeners have died. I'm not sure that would have been a fun thing to go do anyway. But there they are. So this is the cloister. I don't know if it's the same thing from the movie, but yeah, they used to be open for public visitation, and you could walk around the gardens, etc., and enjoy the gardens. But I'm not sure how much fun that would have been to find either of them naked in the weeds doing their thing. I don't know. So Malmesbury, cute kind of little town. But so Hobbes is from there, and they still vote on the philosopher of the year from Malmesbury. But it's a Malmesbury resident, so it's not like it's a famous philosopher somewhere else. But they do invite philosophers in to give lectures. For example, Roger Scruton. Malmesbury Abbey. Well, I don't know if I'll be able to find that one or not, but he did give a lecture one of the years in the dinner that honors Thomas Hobbes. But let's get to Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes is born, goes to school in an abbey, but does not become a priest, the same as Descartes. So that's an odd thing that happens in the modern period, that you've got educated people that are not at the same time monks or priests and archbishops and things. I mean, you do have, of course, others that are. They're pretty significant too. But the funny thing about Hobbes is that he eventually ends up becoming a tutor to other nobles' children. He's not a noble himself, but he ends up being a tutor to the children of others. And those are significant enough. For example, one of his young men that he tutors is eventually going to be Charles II. Right? Charles I, king, the one that gets his head chopped off. And eventually, after Oliver Cromwell dies, and his son doesn't last like 9 months as the replacement for Oliver Cromwell as their fearless leader, the protector. Then they have all sorts of problems in England, and they finally agree to bring back the monarchy, and they get Charles back from France, and he comes in as king again, and he starts the monarchy again, Charles II. And he was taught by Thomas Hobbes. So Thomas Hobbes thought of himself as born a twin of fear. It's kind of a famous line. The reason was he was born when the Spanish Armada was approaching England and could be seen off the coast. And his mom gave birth to him, I think, 2 weeks early. And so she was scared to death of the Spanish Armada coming, and he was born early. So he was born a twin of fear. As you know, the Armada was kept away thanks to the work of Sir Walter Raleigh and others that used fire ships to burn the entire fleet that had linked itself all together for protection against the storm. And as a result, one ship caught fire after another until the whole fleet sunk. And the Spanish were bankrupt because they had spent all their money building all these ships and then thought that they would use them to attack England, and instead, of course, it just sunk. And so that was the end of the Spanish wealth, basically, for the most part, as a result of that. The huge Spanish Armada just all burned to pieces by 4 fire ships that were set on fire and sailed into the mass of ships and set them all on fire. And Sir Walter Raleigh swam back to the other ships in the fleet to get. And of course, he was Elizabeth's hero and probably good boyfriend. I don't want to get into the, as well as he brought all the tobacco and stuff, from the New World too. But in any case, so Thomas Hobbes is a tutor, and he also goes to Europe. One of the things, he took young men and they hiked around Italy, and one of the things they were really puzzled about were finding skeletons of animals way the heck up in like 4,000 foot level in the mountains, and they were trying to figure out how the heck did these sea creatures get up here, when the ocean's way down there, and they figured it was the flood. Noah's, the flood, the great flood, washed them up there. However, Hobbes is into mathematics, but not very good. He's famously involved in the squaring the circle argument, as he was one of the ones who thought you could actually come up with a formula that you could take any circle and figure out its equivalence in square area of the circle. And mathematicians, from what I understand, feel, no, you can't do that. So he basically was wrong and not considered to be a great mathematician in his day. He did translate Greek into English, and by the way, this is at the same time as the King James translation of the Bible and Shakespeare. So you put roughly all of this going on at the same time. You've got Shakespeare writing plays, and by the way, there's a good question of whether Shakespeare was really Shakespeare, or if it was actually Francis Bacon or some other, the Earl of Shaftesbury. There's like lots of individuals that are supported by clubs that think that somebody else wrote the plays and not Shakespeare. And of course, I guess the majority of folks think that it was really a guy who had no education that wrote the plays that Shakespeare wrote. So that's kind of interesting. But the famous book, of course, is the one I have just about highlighted there, Leviathan, which means a big fish, a whale probably. But in the book, if you look at the cover of it, it has a picture of a huge guy with a sword. I'm sure they have it somewhere. There's Hobbes in Paris. Somewhere they ought to have a picture. Here we go. So here's the original cover of the Leviathan, right?
Looks like Descartes.
And if you look close enough at this huge guy, which would obviously be the king, and carrying the sword, which is civil power, and the crozier, or whatever this is, which is church power. There's 300 people making up. You see, these are all, people. Is that neat or what? I'm not sure what, but clearly here's the church on this side and the
Probably
state
just
on the other
enlarge
side.
it by doing this.
Could I?
Probably.
No kidding. Thank you.
And then pull it down. You can see the There you go.
You see all the people.
So is that to say the power, the civil and the religious power of the king come from the people?
Yes. It's a social contract. So this is Hobbes' significance. I mean,
Is he
he's,
the first social contract philosopher credited?
for the most part, yes. I think, when you get to something, a big idea like that, there's clearly interconnections with all sorts of other people. One of his teachers, not in the university, but one of his mentors was Francis Bacon, who's kind of a famous philosopher on his own, for lots of reasons. There's also an interesting connection with the way the Reformation influenced England. So if you think, we've got Martin Luther and John Calvin, and they start their own church. They influence John Knox. John Knox comes to Scotland and starts the Presbyterian Church, which is a church where the presbyters, the rich, bourgeoisie, basically, the beginning, right, are the ones that run, the church by like a council, right? Well, that works so well for the church that the Scots decided to apply that to the towns. So the towns became run by the presbyters or a council, right? And that leads to the idea of a democracy, the idea of the people in charge, not the top-down structuring, of the Pope through the cardinals, through the archbishops, through the bishops, through the monsignors, etc. Right? So you get this trickle-down effect, literally, from Scotland down into Edinburgh, and it becomes the way it's taught there, and that eventually affects Hobbes when he was a young man. So there's some of this idea already there. So even though he's the one that applies it to the government at large and calls it a social contract, it doesn't just come out of no place, right? Even in the mind of Thomas Hobbes. But when we look at the way the Leviathan starts, he starts talking about the body and how all of our knowledge comes through our senses, right? And he's not going to say that we're confused the way Descartes does, but he also doesn't say that there's a mind and a body. Instead, everything is physics from Galileo. Galileo, does all this movement studies, and everything, and so this moves into this and that, and so on. So all these movements, Hobbes applies to psychology, and as what was her name, Sophia Hoffman or whatever her name was in the movie Mind Walk, says that Descartes says that the body is like a machine. So does Hobbes. So both Descartes and Hobbes, absolutely startling, thinks of all bodies as machines, like the clock, right? And so, what makes us do what we do? It's a response to a stimuli, says Hobbes. So, our bodies respond to the pressures, to the light. I remember the first time I read the Leviathan as a young man. I'm reading it, and he's talking about how our eyes literally see things because particles from those things hit our eyes. And I thought, what a ridiculous idea, that particles are flying out of the thing and hitting our eye, But then I realized, well, wait a minute. Those things are called photons today. And so he's actually right. But for the first, I don't know that anyone came up with that idea of our eyes are actually receiving stuff. And that's what enables us to sense that we're seeing stuff. But he goes through all the senses, talking about how we feel pressure. And he doesn't understand blood, the flow of the blood. That hasn't been invented yet. Instead, he thinks they're full of air, these tubes. And so when we push on things, there's air pressure. There's air pressure. They're wrong about a lot of things. They thought heat flowed as some sort of a substance. So it literally flowed from one thing to another. So a warm thing flowed this heat into other things. There was a name for it too. I can't think of it offhand. But it's funny how they thought things, right? Well, they're coming up with physical ideas. And there was another physician, it's the physician, not the doctor. It's Europe's physician. I'm really having trouble with that one. That's silly. So here it is. Europe's physician, Dr. Now his name was Meyer in Theodore. See, I don't know if you can see his name here. This is his name. 1573 to 1655. And he was wealthy when he died. Not Trevor Roper, the historian that wrote the book, died in 2003. Theodore Meyer in 1655. He was originally from Switzerland, and became a physician that believed that there were physical reasons for people's health instead of magical reasons. So, like, you should eat food. And there's stuff in the food that will make your body healthy and strong. Now, if you think about it, this is in a culture where they believe that the soul and the body are in a contest with one another, and what you want to do is honor the soul by punishing the body. So things you do to be stronger and protect your soul is fast, not eat. Punish your body, smack it with whips and things, right? You know, because you want to show the body who's boss, right? You know, spare the rod, spoil the body, right? Right? You know, so it's all thinking that the soul is the important part, and that illness is basically a punishment for sins and so on, right? And how do you prevent sinning? Well, not enjoying yourself, right? You know, so don't do things that the body likes, right? You know, punish the body, even like, this is kind of amazing. So, for example, this was Ivan Grozny. His name in Russian means terrible, and what it means is he was filthy. Grozny means dirty, filthy, terrible.